our platform for what we'll be thinking about over the next two weeks. After his suffering, this is Jesus, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. The more I've looked at these words over the last week or so, the more intrigued and fascinated I've become with that reference to many convincing proofs. You might have thought that the fact that Jesus, who a few days earlier had hung on the cross and been placed in a tomb, the fact that he was appearing and talking to his followers, you might have thought that would be enough. That's all the proof they would have needed. But it seems that Jesus believed it was necessary to go beyond that, to give them a range of compelling proofs so that they would be left in no doubt at all that he was alive. And even the idea of convincing proofs is slightly strange, as it's easier to think of proof as proof without there being different levels of proof. My proof is better than your proof, sort of thing. A couple of weeks ago, someone, not anybody here, said to me that he would do something. And the following day, he told me that he had done it. But so far, unless Ruth tells me otherwise, I haven't seen any evidence that he has done so. And if he had, I would have known. So far, not so convincing. Not much proof going on there. But when we think about detectives, for example, trying to build a case against a suspect, which I admit I know nothing about, but we can sort of imagine them trying to amass a range of proofs that all come together to tell a compelling story. That the suspect was in a particular place, that the suspect had the means to carry out the crime, that the suspect seemed to have benefited from the crime, he had a reason for doing it, and so on, with the idea that all of these proofs come together and provide a convincing case for a jury. Or we can think of two people starting out in a relationship and professing their love for each other. Then over the days and the weeks that follow, they each start to see the other person doing things and saying things that more fully demonstrate their love for the other. And so their confidence in the other person's love for them grows. It is being proven to them. And Jesus seemed to think it was necessary to convince his followers in a range of different ways that he was actually and genuinely alive. It was so unexpected. He had tried to tell them this is what was going to happen, but they hadn't been able to get their heads around it. And who can blame them? It was so outside of their understanding of what was possible that they could easily have been forgiven with trying to come up with other explanations. But it also told them something about himself that Jesus wanted them so much to realize. And it was important for what was ahead of them. Jesus was going to go back to heaven, and we'll think about that in a few weeks' time. They were going to carry on the mission he had started, and many of them were going to be imprisoned, persecuted, and killed because they were prepared to stand and proclaim the name of Jesus. So they needed total, unshakable confidence that the Jesus they were speaking about, the Jesus they were committing their lives to, had actually defeated death, was alive, and was the Son of God. And so Jesus gave them many convincing proofs. And we read about some of them at the end of the Gospels. Not all of them. Paul, when he writes to the church at Corinth in his first letter, chapter 15, he talks about some of the times that Jesus appeared to people that we don't have a record of in the Gospels. But we get some of them in the Gospels. And we're going to look at some of those briefly to try and work out what was convincing about them, what impact they had on the people Jesus met. And some of the stories we will look at are ones Lisa was exploring here last Sunday. But that's okay. It is a bit difficult to piece together exactly what happened when, as the different gospel writers give slightly different accounts, but we're not going to let that get in our way. It just adds to the fun. According to John, the first appearance is when Jesus appeared to a lady called Mary Magdalene, shortly after she had discovered the empty tomb. The place where Jesus had been buried was now empty, and Mary finds that, and she and two disciples she just told, they didn't know what to make of it all. We find that story in John chapter 20, and Ruth is going to come and read that for us now.
John chapter 20, verses 11 to 18. Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken away my Lord," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. "Jesus," she said, "do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her.
Thanks, Ruth. So Jesus appears to Mary. Mary has appeared before in the story of Jesus. The first time we read about her in Mark, first time, it's not the first time we read about her, but the thing that tells us something about her early on in that encounter is in Mark 16, where we're told that Jesus had freed her from being possessed by 7 demons. She'd been under the influence of evil spirits. She wasn't able to make her own decisions. She was not free to make her own choices. And Jesus had freed her from that. He'd released her from bondage into a new and meaningful life. A life that she could live as she chose and not under that control of evil forces. And the choice that she made was to commit herself to Jesus, to follow him, to become part of the group who gathered around him as he walked and taught and healed and performed miracles in Galilee. And we're even told in Mark 15 that Mary and a group of other women supported Jesus and his followers in their ministry, which was so important to a wandering group of people who had no fixed place to live. So Jesus had a big impact on Mary. She was free from all the evil influence that had been upon her, and she was following Jesus. And her following Jesus took her outside the walls of Jerusalem as she cared enough for him that she was willing to stand near his cross and watch him die. In that moment, she could not do anything to help him, but she wanted to be there for him. Maybe she hoped that her presence would have offered some small comfort to him as he suffered and as he died. When Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate and asks if he can take the body of Jesus down from the cross, and is given permission to do so. And he takes that body, he carefully and gently wraps it and places it in a tomb. Mary was there. Mary was watching to see where Jesus was buried. She came back to the tomb early on the following Sunday morning and found it was empty. What must it have been like for her in that moment? The person who had given her her life back, the person she had seen doing amazing things, the person who had spoken so much truth and goodness, the person she had committed her life to was gone. There wasn't even a body to anoint with spices. What had gone wrong? What was left for her? Where was she going to go from there? No wonder, as she stood by the empty tomb, she was crying. And then she turns around and sees Jesus, but did not realize that it was him. Was there something different about him? Were tears obscuring her view? Did her knowledge that dead people did not rise means that she just couldn't recognize him? It's like when we see somebody out of context and we think it cannot be them because that's not where they are. Was there some other reason that she couldn't recognize him? And in some of the other appearances of Jesus, and we'll see this, people did not realize it was him to start with. And so we're left thinking that the experience of death and resurrection has changed his appearance some way. And that's probably not too surprising. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 speaks about the resurrection body being in some way different to the body that has died. So something maybe had changed about Jesus. And so she sees him, she doesn't recognize him, and then she does. What was it that made the difference? That made her realize that however impossible it seemed, the man in front of her was the living, breathing, risen Jesus. It wasn't actually just hearing his voice. Verse 15 says that he asked her why she was crying, and even hearing him speak to her, she just assumed he was the gardener. No, it was, as Lisa mentioned last Sunday, it was Jesus speaking her name, Mary. In the same way I expect as Jesus had always spoken it, that broke through the tears and despair and convinced her that it was Jesus. For Mary, all the convincing proof that she needed was to hear her name spoken by Jesus. And her mission and purpose in life was restored. She could continue to follow him. Later that same day, two of those early followers of Jesus were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, a 7-mile journey. So had plenty of time to chat and to think and to reflect. And as they went, they were going over everything that had happened in the last few days, trying to make sense of it all, trying to work out what was going to happen next. What were they going to do as the center of their lives had been ripped away? And suddenly, Jesus comes up and walks alongside them. But just like Mary, they didn't recognize him at first. And Jesus gets involved in the conversation, and he has a go at them. He challenges them for their lack of understanding, which at first was probably not what they wanted to hear. They'd suffered a terrible loss, and here was someone telling them that they should have expected it and that it had to happen, and that they should have understood that. And maybe, in a strange way, this started to give them some level of comfort as they started to realize that the death of Jesus was part of a bigger plan. But yeah, the grief and the loss would still have been there. And then as they reach their destination, Jesus looks as though he's going to carry on walking, but they encourage him to come and rest with them, to eat with them. And during the meal, Jesus takes a piece of bread, he gives God thanks for it, and breaks it in front of them. And in that act, they suddenly realized that it was Jesus. They would have seen Jesus do this many times before as they had spent time with him in his ministry. They would probably have heard about the time that Jesus broke bread as he ate a last meal with his closest followers before his arrest and death. But it wasn't just that, okay, he's broken that bread in that way, and so we're going to recognize Jesus. Luke makes it clear that there was divine action taking place. God was doing something. In verse 16 in Luke 24, it says that when Jesus joined them, they were kept from recognizing him. So it wasn't just they didn't recognize him, but they were prevented from recognizing. God had done something so that they could not see that it was Jesus. And then in verse 31, it says, now their eyes were opened. For these two followers of Jesus, the convincing proof involved Jesus performing a specific action, but also God doing something, God affecting a change in their lives and understanding. And that's really important, and we'll think a bit about that a bit later. We'll skip over a few of the appearances of Jesus, but do take time to read those last few chapters in the Gospels and just reflect on those times when Jesus appears to his followers. But we're going to move on to the time when he appeared to Thomas. Now, Thomas was one of the early 12 followers of Jesus, and we read about this in John 20, 24 to 29. Just before that, in 19 to 23, there's an account of a time when Jesus had appeared to the 10 followers. So Judas had died, Thomas wasn't there, and the 10 were there. And Jesus appears to them. He shows them his hands, he shows them his side, the marks of crucifixion, as a visual indicator that he had gone through death and come out the other side. And understandably, they rejoiced, it tells us, when they saw Jesus. Now, Thomas, for whatever reason, wasn't there. He must have felt really left out when he rejoined them after Jesus had gone. And they told him that they had seen Jesus. And his response, what would your response would have been? His response was that he needed proof before he would believe. And the proof he was demanding was not just that he could see the marks of the nails and the spear, as the other disciples had, but that he could touch them as well. He was looking for a higher level of proof. And 7 days later, the 11 of them, including Thomas, were back together in the same house, and Jesus reappears. He greets them all with words of peace, and then he turns specifically to Thomas. He indicates the wounds of the cross, the mark of the nails, the hole in his side, and invites Thomas to touch them as he had demanded. But it was not necessary. The presence of Jesus, the words of Jesus, the sight of those wounds was enough. And Thomas recognized that Jesus was alive, that he was king, that he was God. For Thomas, and it looks like the other disciples as well, in this account it seemed to be the sight of those wounds that was compelling evidence. And Jesus recognizes that, but also points to those like us who will believe in him without having had the opportunity to see those wounds and how they'll be blessed as a result. And the last appearance we're going to look at is recorded in John 21. Some of the disciples, including Peter and Thomas, had gone fishing. Jesus appears by the side of the lake after they spent a frustrating night not catching anything, and he calls out to them. And again, they did not immediately recognize Jesus. There's a theme here. Jesus encourages them to throw their nets in a particular place. As they do so, they net an enormous catch of fish. And in some way, it seems to be it's this demonstration of power that causes one of the disciples to recognize this was Jesus and to tell Peter. Peter, acting impetuously as he often did, left everyone else in the boat and jumped in the water to get to Jesus as quickly as possible. And symbolically, Peter is saying that he isn't going to go back to fishing. He was the one who instigated this fishing trip. Maybe he was trying to think about what life was going to be like moving forwards. Do I go back to my old job? And as he jumps in the water and leaves that behind him, symbolically he's saying that no, that is in his past. In his future, he's going to continue to follow Jesus and to serve him. So on this occasion, it was a demonstration of power that convinced the disciples that Jesus was there and alive. And so, Mary, the two on the road to Emmaus, Thomas, the disciples, they were all convinced. They'd had their convincing proofs. They knew that Jesus was alive through a spoken name, a divine revelation, a sight of the marks of the cross, a demonstration of power. All were used to convince people who knew and loved Jesus that he was alive. And they were changed as a result. They had a renewed purpose. They were filled with joy. They recommitted themselves to Jesus. And their experience and the stories of the other appearances can be part of giving us confidence that Jesus is alive and that we can rejoice in that as well. And I've been thinking about that and reflecting on it during this week, and it is something to rejoice in, something we celebrated last Sunday. And in our prayer meeting on Wednesday evening, one of the things we did was we continued to celebrate that wonderful truth and its implications. Jesus being alive tells us that he has defeated sin and death and the grave. They have no power over us anymore. It tells us that Jesus is alive today. He lives in the power of an endless life. He will continue to live forever. The resurrection of Jesus means that we can have eternal, everlasting life as we associate ourselves with him. The resurrection of Jesus makes it possible that one day Jesus will return and we shall see him and we shall be like him. It is amazing and wonderful good news. And a recent survey in this country suggested that 45% of people in this country believe in the resurrection of Jesus. Some question some of the details, but nearly half the population, according to this survey, believe in some way in the resurrection of Jesus. I actually find that quite staggering. I would expect the number to be a lot less, but apparently that's what came up. But it does suggest that there are good opportunities to engage with people and talk with them about this. It's what people, at least half the people you're likely to meet, seem to have some understanding of. And it's great when we find opportunities or can make opportunities to do so. So it's important that we recognize some of those proofs that Jesus brought to his followers. We look at the changes it made in their lives. We look at the changes it's made in people's lives over the last 2,000 years. We think about the changes it's made in our lives. And it's something we can be confident in, something we can rejoice in, something we can celebrate. And that should surely give us a desire to share that with others. But we do need to recognize that we can't convince people who refuse to be convinced. I remember a time when I arranged to meet up with a man in Tamworth, where we were living before we came here. He'd had a really deep faith. He'd been heavily involved in church life, but he'd given it all up. And I was speaking to him one day, and I found the reason. I think it was over an Easter period as we were celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, and I was speaking to him, and I found that the reason he had walked away from it all was that he could not accept the truth of the resurrection. He just couldn't get it in his mind. He was a very deep thinker, a very clear thinker, a very rational, logical thinker, and he couldn't equate that to his understanding of the world. And so we arranged to meet and to talk, and we spent a couple of hours together. We covered a lot of ground. He'd explored it, he had a lot of reasons, he had a lot of objections. And at the end of those 2 hours, he admitted that I had been able to answer all of his questions and address all of his concerns. He had nothing left to say, well, hang on, this proves it can't be true. We'd covered all of that. But he still wasn't prepared to accept it. He left saying that there must be some other explanation that he hadn't thought of yet. And I had to respect that. I disagreed with it, but I had to respect it. So please do seek opportunities to speak with people about the resurrection. Please do speak about the change that the risen Jesus has made and continues to make in your life. And let's rejoice when people come to meet that same Jesus through what we're able to share with them. But let's also recognize that it is only God who changes people's lives, who changes their understanding, who changes their appreciation of Jesus, just as he changed the perception of those at Emmaus. And so when people aren't convinced, just as Thomas wasn't by what the other disciples told him, let's recommit ourselves to pray for others that God will break in and reveal Jesus to them. We have a wonderful reality to live in because Jesus is alive. We have a wonderful story to tell because Jesus is alive. Let's rejoice in that and continue to walk with the risen Jesus who knows us and calls us by name. Let's be quiet for a moment. I'll pray, and then Chris is going to come and lead us in one final song. Father, I want to thank you that the resurrection story is true. I want to thank you that Jesus defeated sin and death and the grave, that he was restored to life. He was restored to life in power, that he lives in the power of that endless life. And he chooses to come and meet with people and to welcome them to come and share the power of that risen life with him. And I want to thank you that we have met with that Jesus in many different ways. And I just pray that we will continue to live in the light and the knowledge of his resurrection. And I want to pray for any here this morning who have not met Jesus in that way, that, Lord, you would speak into their lives and show them that Jesus is alive and he wants to share life with them. Lord, help us just to rejoice in the risen Jesus, we pray. Amen. Thanks, Chris.